Hi, everybody. Welcome to Statistics Solutions webinar, Chapter 5. Hi, we have a co-host on who's going to, in a few minutes in the chat box, put where you can locate this webinar after there. Okay. Yep. On our website. The webinar will be archived on our website, and as well as other webinars, and check our website out. It has resources too, and blogs and things that would be helpful to you. Okay, great. Okay, so let's get started. Oh, well, one thing before we get started. I will answer questions at the end. So if you have questions as we go along, you can type them in the question and answer box, or jot them down yourself, whatever, just so you don't forget them. But I won't get to them until the end. All right, so let's get started. Chapter 5, the discussion. Our model for the dissertation follows one that's fairly typical, although there are other models. This is the 5-chapter dissertation, where chapter 1 is typically the introduction, chapter 2 is typically the lit review, chapter 3 is the methods, chapter 4 you present your results, and chapter 5 you discuss your results. There are other models. Sometimes there are more chapters, or sometimes a chapter 5 is split. Recommendations will be a separate chapter, like chapter 6, but ours is fairly standard. And while the components of the chapter 5, the discussion, are pretty standard, I always recommend that people get their school's template, just to see if there's there may be minor differences. Sometimes the headers or the sections are sequenced a little differently, so it's always best, even though this is a good standard model, it's always best to get your template for your school. Okay, so chapter 5, if you're here at chapter 5, congratulations, because that's a oh, you can't see the slides. Okay, hold on. Seeing your calendar out because I have the wrong screen. Sorry. Is that better? Yeah, okay. Sorry, I shared the wrong screen. I apologize for that. Okay. Great. Okay, so chapter 5 is the discussion, where you presented your findings in chapter 4. Now you need to basically talk about your findings. You need to interpret them. You need to discuss your findings. It's also the chapter where you make recommendations based on your findings, for practice and recommendations for further research. So the chapter 5, while it's not maybe as involved or as long as other chapters, it's real important because it's this is what things have been kind of leading to, right? This is the culmination. This is where you get your findings. This is where you talk about them. This is where you make your points. This is where you kind of sell the importance of your study. Right. So let's just look at here's what we're going to be talking about today. The typical, there's sections that are typical for chapter 5. Again, get a hold of your template. There may be minor differences, but this is pretty standard. All right. So for the introduction, much like the introduction to other chapters in the dissertation, you really want to just reorient your reader about what you're doing. So it doesn't need to be long. So it's usually good to start off with maybe restate the purpose of your study. Remind the reader of the importance of your study, why it needed to be conducted. And you can also preview contents of the chapter if you want at the end of the introduction. Again, see what your template calls for, but that's pretty standard. It's not long. It's probably less than a page. All right. The next section, this is really the heart of the discussion chapter. This is interpretation of the findings. It's usually called, sometimes it's called discussion, even though it's that a chapter is called discussion. Sometimes this section is called discussion, or discussion of the findings, interpretation of the findings. This is where this is where people kind of get tripped up sometimes. They're not really sure what they're supposed to provide, what they're supposed to do here. And I know sometimes I've seen it, people aren't sure, so they make the mistake of, they just kind of copy and paste material from their results, right? Because they're not sure. Don't do that. That's not what they're looking for. They're not just looking for kind of, a rehash of the results. What they mean by interpretation really is you're discussing your findings in relation to the findings of previous research, and then you're making conclusions based on that. And sometimes it's in relation to your theory too. So what you want to do for this section is probably start off with your research questions, just restate the research questions, or even provide them verbatim. Something like the following research questions guided this investigation. Present your research questions, and then kind of summarize your findings, right, in a real kind of plain spoken way. All the statistics are in chapter 4. We don't need many, if any, statistics in chapter 5, very few, because it's a more kind of plain spoken chapter. So after you relate your research questions, you want to summarize what you found in real plain spoken terms. For this section 2, you're going to want to subdivide it, right? Use subsections. If it's if your study is quantitative, you want to subdivide it by research questions or by hypotheses. Research question 1, here's what I asked, here's what I found, and then set up a discussion based on what you found in relation to the findings of previous major research on your topic. And that is found in chapter 2, right? That's the connection between the discussion chapter and the lit review chapter. If you're writing, if your study is qual, lay out your research questions, summarize them, but then you're going to want to subdivide the section by themes, right? That's kind of the easiest way to do it. And there's a couple of reasons for this. To subdivide it by either research question or by themes. It's going to be reader friendly, right? Your reader can say, okay, here's what you found in theme 1, or for research question 1, here's what you found for the next theme or for the next research question. And it's going to be writer friendly, right? It's if you start talking about all your findings together, it's going to get confusing. So have some kind of strategy, to subdivide it, again, by research question or by theme. And the idea, again, is to discuss what you found in relation to major findings on the topic from previous research. And you want to note where your findings, they either agree with previous research, or they don't agree, or maybe they even add something unexpected or something new or novel. So you want to indicate that convergence or divergence from previous research. You can do that for research question 1 or theme 1, then you move on to the next one and you do it until you're finished. You can also bring in your theory here if you're kind of stuck for material to add, because they're looking for kind of a substantial discussion. It doesn't have to be long, but you have to really talk about what your findings mean in relation to these other findings. What did so and so find? Does your findings agree with those or not? If they didn't agree with it, sometimes you usually have to try to explain that. Maybe your population was different, or there's something in the literature that will help you understand why your findings may have been different than previous research. If you need to bring your theory in, you can do that here. Your theories help explain things, so your theory should be able to help you explain what you found, relate it to your theory. You can bring that in where needed. Okay. If your findings support previous research, yes, they confirm what's in some of the major, research. Then you can make conclusions on that, right? Because here's what you found. Your finding supports previous research. Okay, that means you can make a pretty solid conclusion based on that. If your findings diverge or they don't support previous research, that's okay. I mean, it still tells us something. Sometimes people get kind of disheartened when, I didn't find what I was expecting to find, or it doesn't support previous research, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, that's what you're conducting a study for, to see what you get, and that still tells us something. But if your findings don't confirm previous research, that suggests that there's still inconclusiveness about the topic, right? You found this, however, previous research shows something else. So that means there's probably, further research needs to be conducted in the area to get more kind of information, more confirmation. And you can kind of allude to that here, but then you want to, talk about those recommendations for further research in a later section in the chapter. But that's the idea with the interpretation of the findings. Subdivide it out, summarize your, what you found, and then discuss those findings in relation to previous research, major previous research that's found in your chapter 2. Okay. Or your theory. You can bring your theory in too, as needed, to help you with the interpretation. Okay, limitations is next. And again, you're going to spend probably most of your time on that section I just talked about, the interpretation section. Limitations, this is where you talk about any kind of weaknesses or shortcomings or anything that may have affected your results. Usually in chapter 1 or 3, or sometimes both, back in your proposal, you may have had a limitation section. And at that point, it was forward looking, right? You hadn't conducted the study yet. Here are some limitations that you think you may encounter. So you can go back to the chapter 1 or the chapter 3, the limitations, and see if what you proposed might be limitations actually ended up being limitations. But these are things like the big one for quantitative studies is a low sample size. If you have a low sample size, that affects your statistical certainty. So that would be a big limitation. You would just have to say, just explain that limitation, that you had a low sample size and what that means, and that the findings need to be kind of interpreted with that limitation in mind. It doesn't undercut your study at all or your findings. It just lets the reader know that these things need to be considered when we look at my findings. Sometimes for qualitative studies, sometimes researcher bias is a limitation. If you're very close to the study or the topic, sometimes researcher bias can be a problem. In this, if that was, you think that may have been a problem, you can talk about ways that you can mention that, talk about ways that you try to mitigate or prevent researcher bias, and there are different ways to do that. I also want you to usually talk about the generalizability of your results to the larger study population here a little bit. Not much, just to see if what you found is generalizable to the larger study population. And for quantitative studies, if your study was adequately powered, meaning that you had your sample size was adequate or above it, what you needed, generalizability usually should be pretty good. Now there's other things that influence that, like your sampling, whether your recruitment method, like if you use convenience sampling, that might reduce your generalizability a little. Random sampling is the best for generalizability. So you want to talk about that, how well your findings generalize. For qual studies. Your findings aren't meant to generalize. I mean, you have a low sample size by design because you are trying to get that in-depth information from, you may have done interviews, may have had 8, 10, 12 participants. That's because you're trying to get that, with those interviews, that in-depth information about participants' perceptions and their experiences. So your sample size is going to be low, so your findings aren't going to generalize, but they're not meant to. So it's worth saying that. And what they're meant to do is to get that deep information that quantitative studies with these larger sample sizes can't provide. Okay, or any kind of other limitations, any kind of things that may have affected your results, you're going to want to put down here. And what I always recommend too, if you haven't already, and you probably have by this point, get an example of an approved dissertation from your school that's close to what you're doing. Just to see how people have handled some of these sections, because you can go to webinars, you can use your resources, you can read about them, which is all good. But when you sit down to write, excuse me, sometimes there's just no better resource than a good example. Okay, implications for practice, and this is like it sounds. This is what do your findings mean for people at the level of practice in whatever topic it is you're dealing with? How can it inform what they do? What does it mean to professionals in that field? And these aren't general implications or general recommendations. They're specifically based on what you found, right? So if you say you conducted an education study and it was on why special education teachers leave the field, right? Now, who do you think would be really interested or would consider that information valuable? Obviously special education teachers, but I think even more so administrators, right? So yeah, administrators, because they, principals, district level leaders, supers, these are the people who do the recruitment, do the hiring, design the professional development for them. So yeah, if you did that kind of study, you would talk about what kind of the value this has for administrators and possibly other stakeholders as well, like teachers themselves. But that's the idea here. It's the value basically of your information, your data, what you found at the level of practice, right? How can it inform folks at the level of practice of what they do? And you can kind of get nuts and bolts here. If that information would be best disseminated through like professional development or seminars, things like that. You can say you can say that as ways to get that information to them. Okay, implications for practice, recommendations for further research. Another important piece, and you see this in articles that you probably read at the end, they all have recommendations for further research. You're going to do the same thing for your study. These again, these are not general recommendations. These are based on what you found and sometimes based on your limitations. So any finding that when you go back to your findings, right? And sometimes I find it helpful just to kind of pull your findings out. And if you use 2 screens, it's helpful. Just kind of pull your findings out and set them to the side. So when you're writing this section, you can see what you actually found and you can see what kind of should follow from that. Any kind of finding that where you're your findings do not support previous research. They don't align with previous research. That's fair game for recommendations for further research, because that means there's still some kind of, something unsettled in the research, inconclusiveness. Any finding anything that you find that's unexpected or new or novel, that definitely warrants further exploration, right? Further investigation, because it's something that was unexpected, or something that's new, or something that people weren't thinking about before. You can also recommend different kinds of studies, right? To obtain different kinds of information. So if you did a quant study and that you really think that based on what you found, hey, it gives us some information here, some solid information, but it would be really good if we dug deeper into this in a different angle. Like if we got more people's their in-depth perceptions, how they experience this phenomenon, whatever it is. You could recommend qualitative studies, right? And if you do that, if you recommend different kinds of studies, also make sure to talk about a little bit about why and what kind of information that would give you, right? That's different. So for calls, like if you recommended a call study, you would want to be getting that kind of that rich kind of in-depth information about the topic that you couldn't get with a quant study. Same thing if you just reverse it. If you did a qual study and you identified some good I don't know, factors or constructs or something, and you think we need confirmation about if these things are really linked or not, you could recommend quantitative studies. There's also studies like longitudinal studies. These are studies that are conducted over time with multiple data collection points, and longitudinal studies are good things to recommend if you wanted to examine the topic over time, or it's a process maybe. So you want to see how it develops over time. You could recommend like longitudinal studies. So that's another idea for recommendation for further research, different kinds of studies. Recommendations based on limitations. You can do that too. And the idea here is just to recommend that people replicate your study, but that they just make sure they address what was a limitation in your study. And I think we're at the end. Yeah, the summary. Yeah, check your school's template, because sometimes your school will let you stop at the recommendations for further research. Sometimes your school wants a summary or conclusion. So you want to recap major points from the chapter. And since it is the end of the dissertation too, right? The whole thing. Don't just recap major points from the chapter, but you also want to leave your reader with a take-home message, right? This is the most important things about your study that you want them to remember. So your findings that were most relevant or most significant or most important, you want to reemphasize those. Basically, you want to sell your results, sell the major points from your study that you found. Leave the reader with a take-home message, right? Okay. And that is really it. Again, the big section is going to be the interpretation of the findings. Okay, here's who we are. Our contact information. If you think, you're welcome to schedule a free consultation to see if what we do is, would help you, would be right for you. Let's see if we have questions. Okay, yes, we do have questions. Let me see. Okay, here's one. Any advice for you have on how to deal with the discussion chapter when using a classical grounded theory methodology where pre-study literature review is discouraged? Grounded theory, we don't see a lot of grounded theory, and one of the reasons is because it's advanced. And excuse me. Hold on a minute. Let me. Okay, I'm back. I apologize for that. My dogs wanted to chime in, but they're not much help. Yeah, the grounded theory we don't see a lot because it's advanced, and to do it right, it usually takes several rounds of data collection. But for grounded theory discussion chapter, I would think that's where you would want to present your theory, because what grounded theory does, it kind of comes up with a new theory based on your findings. So in the discussion chapter, I would think you would want to discuss your findings and how those lead to the new theory that you're developing through the study. Okay, I was wondering if you had any tips on approaching a mixed methods discussion chapter. Yeah, that's a good question. It kind of depends on your study a little bit, in the sense that some mixed methods are basically predominantly one approach. Like say it's predominantly quantitative, and then you're using like a little bit of a qual stuff to help explain the quant findings, or the reverse. It's basically qualitative, and you have a bit of a quant piece to help with that. If that's the case, I would focus on the whatever approach is predominant, and then kind of let the other part bring in the other material as kind of commentary on your main findings. However, if it's like split right down the middle, like they're kind of equally weighted, the approaches, you may have to talk about each set of findings and then kind of have a section where you synthesize them. So I would say there's a couple ways to go there. One would be pick whatever is the more important set of findings, or the more kind of significant, discuss those, and then have the other set kind of act as commentary on it, or review them both separately, and then have kind of a synthesis section. That would be my suggestion. And I would just, I would talk to your chair too. That's a place where your chair might have their own ideas about how to structure that, but that's kind of my general sense of the mixed methods. Okay, I'm currently working on my chapter 5. My findings did not support the literature. When it comes to discussing the literature in relation to my findings, how is the best way to address previous literature without being repetitive, even though my findings are not supportive of them? Really approach it the same way. It's okay if your findings don't support previous literature. That's fine. Your findings are what they are. You get what you get, and it still tells us something. You're just going to have to say that they don't. Obviously bring in that literature from chapter 2 that you're talking about, specific stuff, and talk about specifically where your findings don't agree with that. And that's okay. It's something you could pick up on later in the recommendations for further research section. Because there was some inconclusiveness that you recommend more research on it, but and you're going to have to kind of explain that a little bit. In other words, and not a lot, but in other words, why do you think that your findings differ from what's in the literature? And it just depends. I mean, it sometimes, if you use like a different, sample, different population, that might have something to do with it. Maybe you used a different instrument, that measures kind of similar things, but a little differently. That might have something to do with it. Maybe there's something in the literature that might help you explain the difference. So you would want to use that to help with your explanations. But you kind of should still do the same thing as if it supports, obviously, what you say it doesn't support, and then you try to explain that that difference a little bit. Which it's still, part of your discussion. Your discussion would just be that you can't really make conclusions based on that because your findings didn't support. So it still the issue still kind of remains unsettled in the research. Okay, let me see here. Is there a rule of thumb on number of interviews in a qualitative study where the entire population is 138? Same question. I'm not sure I'm getting that. If you qualitative studies usually have 8, 10, 12, 15 participants. I mean, that's if you're doing interviews. If you're doing like semi-structured interviews, your population is going to be low, right? I mean, because interviews, they're involved. Yeah, you can't be interviewing like 138 people or 50 people. And usually too, what is something called saturation when you do doing interviews. That's the point where you're interviewing people and you start getting repeating information, repeating themes. That's saturation. That usually means you can stop. But usually, it's what we see is, 10, 12, 15 participants for qual studies. Okay. Did I get all the questions? I think I did. Any others? Okay, great. If there's no more questions, I'll go ahead and wish you luck. Again, look at our website. We have resources there. We have blogs. We have free consultations just to see what we offer, if that's right for you. And we do have, look at our webinar schedule. We do have other webinars on other topics, on methodology, on different chapters. So check that out. And all right, you're welcome, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for attending, and have a great day. Thank you. Take care.